Hello everyone, Trophy Wine Hunter. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm doing a video on Champagne, just a little primer on it or introduction to the region, plus some of the background and the history of the region, which I think is very interesting. Champagne is a region in northeastern France, and it is producing, of course, champagne or white wine, sparkling wine. And there's two kind of major requirements for champagne. One is that the grapes must originate in the Champagne region. And secondly, that secondary fermentation, which we'll talk about later on, must take place in the bottle. So there are many other sparkling wines in the world, but none of them can be called champagne unless it comes from the Champagne region. And these include Cava, Prosecco, Cremant D'Alsace. All of these, and including our own BC sparkling wines, all of these, even though they are made with the same method, they cannot call themselves champagne. And what the big difference is the type of grapes they use. Cava uses localized grapes, so does Prosecco and Cremant D'Alsace. So they don't use the same blending of grapes that Champagne does, and even though they use the same techniques, what it ends up happening is there are different taste profiles. With Prosecco, the secondary fermentation actually takes place in stainless steel vats instead of the bottle, and again, because of that change, it develops differently. So genuine champagne must at least spend 15 months maturing in the cellar before release, and for vintage, it must be matured at least 3 years before release. And many of the champagnes out there, that's the minimum. They'll actually do more than that. With champagne, there's different levels of sweetness. The most dry would be called extra brut, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, why that came out. Then there's brut, which is still dry, extra sec, which is kind of sweeter than the other first two, then sec, then demi-sec, which is kind of half sweet or half dry, and then doux. So those are the kind of the levels of champagne sweetness. There's also 4 main areas of champagne. There's the Côte de Bar, the Côte de Blanc, there is the Montagne de Rennes, and then the Vallée de Marne. Even within Champagne, there's a classification. The lowest ranking champagnes are called Ultra Cru, then Premier Cru, and then Grand Cru, designating the best sites or the grapes from the best sites. Just looking at one of the champagnes that I'm going to review shortly, this is the Pierre Pellard, and this is a half bottle, kind of a nice little size. This is their 2017. So it is called La Parcelle Bouzy. So it says Grand Cru, and then Montagne de Rennes, which is one of the regions. So again, I will start to look at these more carefully on the labels once I've got this knowledge. Going back to the history of Champagne, which is very interesting. Champagne actually was produced, or wines were produced in the Champagne region back to the 5th century. But at that time, almost all wines produced and drunk were red wines. So the neighboring region of Burgundy had much better climate conditions that were more suited towards the production of red wines than Champagne. And because Champagne did not have the greatest climatic conditions to fully ripen red wine grape varietals all the time, it ended up that they produced a paler version, which was much more acidic and lighter in style, which is what you'll see with some of their, that's some characteristics of Champagne today. And because of that, their region wasn't as popular as Burgundy and maybe the wines of Italy at that day. And so we can see from this is that the palate of people and the prestige do change over time. So even if we think certain wines are really great today, in 50 or 100 years times, other people in those times may question why we drank these wines. And that also shows you kind of the expertise that such wineries like Lafite, Latour, Decem, who have been able to keep up at the top level, even though with changing palates and changing taste of consumers. But the people of Champagne region always thought that they could produce something that rivaled Burgundy. And I think there was a slow progression because they tried to make Burgundy wines. They couldn't make them as well as Burgundy because of climate conditions. They were much paler. They weren't as popular. So somehow that developed into white wine, which was still not as popular as red wines. Even to this day, I think red wines are a little bit more popular in style than red wines, although historically it was much more a red wine drinking world. So most people that talk about Champagne, they think about Dom Perignon. And I've done another video about Dom Perignon in this story. Against Dom Perignon is Dom Pierre Perignon. And as I went through that with that video, Dom is not a first name. It's a title that's given to certain monks that are kind of senior monks. And one of the Doms of each monastery was responsible for the vineyards and the wine making and cellars of the monastery. So in the medieval times, a lot of the innovation or a lot of the winemakers, as you might call them, were actually monks. And the monasteries and the church had a lot to do with the production of wine. So it's kind of a funny association. But I guess that association came with the whole communion service when you have to have wine. So therefore you have to produce wine. And the monks who had lots of times had lots of studies. They were at those times probably the more scholarly people of the medieval times and put more emphasis on the winemaking process since they had to drink it all the time. And so that's a lot of the innovation and a lot of the start of wines were with churches or in particular monasteries with monks. So going back to Dom Perignon, many people associate him as the father of Champagne. He wasn't really. In fact, it was a person called Christopher Merritt, who was a British scientist and physician, who actually in 1662 published a document which stated that the addition of sugar to a finished wine created a secondary fermentation. And that is the basis. The second fermentation is the basis of champagne making. So that's really the difference between still wines, red wines and white wines, and champagne. So with red wines and white wines, you have a fermentation with the yeasting process. But with champagne, we have a little dosage or sweetness added to the wine, which then creates this fizzy process. So this was actually a very popular process in England at that time, and after this invention, and they started to ferment, do this secondary fermentation, and started to have all these fizzy wines, which were all the rage with the nobility. So the nobility actually created this and thought this was a very high-end thing. The boorish people were all drinking this red wine that was just, but now we've got this very elegant white wine with bubbles and fizziness. So the English aristocracy loved this among the high-end circles. Now we go to where, of course, Champagne is in France. In France, at that time, it hadn't caught on. And in fact, Champagne, or the innovation in Champagne, came about because of actually issues with wine. So in the Champagne region, it's colder than what they were producing in England. And so what happened is that because it was colder, the monks had these cellars. They put their bottles into cellars, and perhaps some of them, the yeast, or they didn't fully ferment. They didn't finish their primary fermentation before they put them into their cellars. And that kind of froze the yeast that were not completely used, or the fermentation process wasn't completely complete. And so when the spring came along and the heat in the cellars got higher, the fermentation process started again. And when you ferment in bottle, there is carbon dioxide produced. And so carbon dioxide was produced and all these bottles started to explode because, you know, they didn't know anything about wine. They used to produce still wine and they didn't actually know they were doing secondary fermentation. So all of a sudden you have all these bottles that are exploding in the cellars of the Champagne region. So Dom Perignon was actually asked to get rid of this bubbles. It was a problem because all these bottles were exploding. People didn't know why. So they said, hey, Dom, can you figure it out and get rid of these things? But luckily, Dom Perignon was traveled, and also luckily, the French started to pick up this taste of the English aristocracy. So in England it was popular, then it came over to France and the French said, hey, we like this fizzy stuff too. So with that in mind, Dom Perignon was thinking, well, maybe we should do this. I mean, it looks like there is a market for this stuff that, you know, people like this fizzy stuff, but maybe we don't want wines to explode. So what he did, figured out, I don't know if he did it scientifically or by experiment or how he figured this out, but he just said, hey, listen, we have an exploding bottle, so what can we do about this? So he had traveled to England and he knew that the English had developed some stronger glass that was able to withstand this explosion. And so he used bottles that didn't explode as much. There was stronger glass. And he also put, originally they had corks only on the top of this. They didn't have the mesh. The mesh was actually invented or founded by someone else later on. But he decided to wrap it in hemp, which made it stronger. He did other innovations. One was which also he used Pinot Noir grapes in the production of the wines. A little bit for taste, but mostly because he figured out that, or he believed that red wine grapes were not as fizzy and reduced that whole process. But that's not all that he did, because in the process of studying all this stuff, he also created processes. So he actually figured out that this secondary fermentation process, which was kind of a mistake in Champagne region, he figured out how to control it. But he also did a lot in terms of how they developed grapes, how they sorted grapes, how they picked grapes, how they pruned. So he basically made everything better. He made Champagne more palatable. So that's kind of his contribution to Champagne. He didn't invent it, but he's known as the father of Champagne because he did so much to increase the level, the quality of Champagne, which probably led to the more acceptance of Champagne, particularly among the aristocrats of England and France. I found this particularly interesting in terms of the historical context, and also historically, the wines produced, because they use kind of a bit of sweetness dosage to kind of get that secondary fermentation going. Traditionally, most champagnes were much, much sweeter in style, and the palate that we had in the medieval times was much sweeter. So most of the wines that we're talking about in the 15 or 1600s were probably to us undrinkable, quite frankly. Even if they were top-end wines, they would probably be for our modern palate, either really no taste, like no fruit at all, like quite austere and very tannic and very alcoholic, or sweet, like sweet wine, like kind of almost like let's pour some juice into a red wine or a white wine these days. So the taste that they liked, that sweetness. And the characteristics that we found in the Burgundy or the Champagne region that made it not a good red wine producing region, this high acidity, this lighter style, became the good qualities for champagne, as we see today. We like the acidity of champagne. We like the lightness and the creaminess that comes through in the champagne, in most champagnes. So it wasn't until there was a backlash or someone that thought that it was not good to have such sweet champagnes, and the persons that, or the house that thought it wasn't good, was Pierre Jouet, and they were the first house, and I will give it in the comment section, I believe in the mid 1800s, where they actually had no additive, no sweetness added to after the fermentation process. So it was the first, what we call extra brut style wine. And so going back to this word of brut, when they came out with that, when Pierre Jouet came out with this kind of new wine that was not as sweet, people didn't like it. They thought, wow, this is a big, this is crazy. All this champagne we have is sweet. And then you come up with this dry stuff, and that's why they said it's quite brutish. And so that's where that brut, that word came out. That's because it was for brutes, this, not classy stuff, this not sweet, not delicate stuff. It was so dry, it's for brutes. And so that's the origin of the word brut, one of the origins. Again, there's many different myths or legends about these type of things. But I just find it so interesting historically that the first champagne looked like was way, 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 way different than what we have today. So I think the takeaway for me is that wine and palate and taste are always evolving. And again, we always have we have people that argue about, this wine is terrible, this wine I can't drink this, whatever. That's why I think it's important to take a step back and just enjoy the wines for what it is. If you don't like it, enjoy a wine, you just don't enjoy it. We don't have to be all offensive about a wine and take it so harshly, because maybe in 30 years time that wine will be what everyone drinks. And we've learned that repeatedly through history of wines, that many times wines that are not popular at a certain time come into popularity when palates change. And again, going back to my first comment about the really good wineries, it's really hard to have consistent quality for 100 years. Not that difficult to be in favor for 10 years or 20 years or 50 years. But for 100 or 150 years, it's very difficult, and they must be very, very good quality wineries, because you have to move the tastes. I have no doubt that the Lafitte's of the 1900s or early 1900s were much more tannic and austere than they are today, because they were produced for a different market and produced for long-term aging. Today, there's a lot of pressure on wineries to make wines a lot more accessible, because in the past, 20 years wasn't a long time to wait for greatness. Now, 5 minutes is a very long attention span. So to ask someone to cellar something for even 5 years is very, very difficult for typical consumers or new consumers of wine. Hope you've enjoyed this video, and I've done other videos about Veuve Clicquot, which is also a very famous and historic champagne house. Probably will do another one shortly upon the release of there's a movie coming out on Madame Veuve Clicquot with one of my favorite actresses, Haley Bennett. And so I'm looking forward to that movie, and also to do more reviews of, in fact, older Veuve Clicquot. We'll try and get that in the future. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Until next time, happy drinking.